everybody, my name is Erin and today we're going to be doing a book review on World War Z by Max Brooks. If you were here for my last review, which I will link up above, I decided that I wanted to be a little bit more specific with the way I review things and go a little bit farther in depth with my book reviews without necessarily giving spoilers. So I broke things down into three categories. I have character, plot, and general world building. I also broke each of those categories into smaller subcategories and made each of those things worth 5 points. So I'm going to go ahead and break down this book and we'll see what rating it ends up with. On Goodreads, I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars, and I'm interested to see if, when I really break things down, that is accurate, because I almost gave it 5 stars, but something just didn't quite get there for me. So let's look a little bit deeper. So for character, I have 4 different categories. I had 5 in the last one, but I took off side characters because it doesn't really fit for this. And so I end up with personality, relationships, and development. I also have representation on here, but I'm not going to be giving that a score because I don't feel like I can accurately say how well other groups are represented. All I can do is tell you whether is that representation, not necessarily how well it's done. Let's start with personality. So if you don't know, this book is about the rise and fall of zombies in our country in the future. It's written in interview style, and each interview is a different character from a different part of the world. When I realized that it was an interview style and each time we were changing interviews, which is about every 3 to 5 pages, it was a different person, I was worried that things, whether it would be story or character or personality, would get lost. However, there is not a single interview and character in this book that didn't have a distinct personality, which I think is incredible, given that there are over probably 40 different characters in this book that you interview, and each one felt distinct. Just really stood out as a highlight of this book. I fell in love with each one of them. Not all of them. There are some that you definitely end up disliking because of the things that they do, their motives, their actions during this, but you were really rooting for some of them, and that is hard to accomplish in, again, 3 to 5 pages. So this 100% gets 5 out of 5 for me. Alright, relationships. Now this one isn't necessarily the typical what you would think of for a relationship, because most of the characters in here, in fact almost all of them, relationships are not a highlight. There may be an offhanded mention of, oh, I wanted to get back home to my husband or my kids or my family. So for this, relationships are really going to be how they dealt with other survivors, members of their community, their army, their branch of government, whatever it was. Because each interview was so short, you didn't really get to see much of that. However, I think there were some of them that did stand out. There were a few of them that talked about different friendships. And there was also the negative side. There were people in different branches of the military that didn't agree with their leaders. And you really got a sense of that. But I think overall, relationships were not a highlight. Most of them were individuals telling their story. And you may see other characters coming in, but it wasn't a big part of it. However, there are a few stories that do stand out to me. There's one mentor story that really stands out and makes me feel like that relationship was solid. And there was a pilot who had to rely on someone over the radio to help her kind of get to a safe space to be picked up, and that was such a good story. That was one of my favorite interviews. So I think overall relationship, I would give it probably a 3 out of 5. The next one we have is development. Because you're constantly switching characters, you don't see a lot of growth from any of them. There are, however, 3 or 4 characters that we do come back to towards the end of the book. One in particular that you see, I think, 4 times total, although 3 of those 4 are towards the very end. And so you do get to see some growth from him. You will also just get to see the development of the country. So these interviews take place, I think, a decade after World War Z initially starts. So the first few interviews show when the first few zombies were starting to really show up, how each government handled it, and then, the second part of the book is the real zombie infestation, and then the last part of the book is them moving forward after they've kind of figured things out. So it's broken up into 3 parts, so you see the development in that area, and I think that was really cool. But as far as personal development, you just don't see a lot of it. The few that we did come back to didn't necessarily change their personality, their outlook, anything like that. It was more of like, how am I living now, as opposed to how I was living during World War Z. So as far as development, I'd again give it a 3 out of 5. Alright, before I move on, I do want to mention some representation. This book has interviews from all over the world, so you get to see different groups of people, how different continents, countries, all of that handled World War Z. Most of it is either military groups or people in the government. There are a lot of civilian accounts as well. There is some disability rep. One of the interviews is a story of a guy in a wheelchair and how he's trying to navigate his time on Neighborhood Watch. So yeah, with that we get all different races, all different ages. So I think you get a wide variety in that regard. There is also some mental health discussions in there, which I thought was interesting. A lot of these interviews go on to discuss bad sides of war, the grief, the depression that follows. There wasn't any LGBTQ plus representation in this. I think that was one of the few things that was missing. Overall, out of 15 for characters, I give it an 11. Alright, so for plot, we have 4 categories: timeline and pacing, action, satisfaction and buy-in, especially with the ending, and conflict and villain. So for timeline and pacing, this book moves pretty quickly. Because of the way that it's written, it starts off a little bit hard to get into, but the first story is very intriguing, and so while you're still kind of getting used to the writing style, the actual plot itself is so engaging that you pretty easily sink into it. The way that the book is broken up makes sense, and there weren't any parts that I felt like I was ready to move on from. So, timeline and pacing gets a 5 out of 5. Action. This is the highlight of this book, I would say, is the action. Each story is so intense in its own way, whether it's you discovering that this person did this horrible thing and kind of took advantage of society, or you watching this person struggle to survive page after page, or you knowing that something is going to happen and just waiting for the calm to end. Each story is just so enticing that I struggle to put this book down. The zombie action in this is nonstop. You would think with so many different stories it'd start to feel too similar and lose its charm, but it doesn't. I can't put into words just how unique and truly engaging each of these were. So action is definitely a 5 out of 5. Satisfaction and buy-in. Satisfaction-wise, again, I would probably give it a 5 out of 5. But I think it lost a point for the very end of the book. So at the very end, we started to go back to characters. And to be honest, I just wanted to keep the same thing of going character by character, getting new characters to the very end. Because by the time I got to the last few where it kept trying to go back, I didn't remember who the characters were. I'd read probably 40 to 50 characters at that point. And so I had to go flip through the book because each section at the very top is annotated with what country and city. It'd say Shanghai, and then I'd go 200 pages and all of a sudden I'd see Shanghai again, and I know I've read a story with this character, I can't remember the specifics. And so the last few stories I had to flip back through and kind of check myself, and that really took me out of the story, where I think if we had just had new characters, it would have wrapped up just as well. Give that a 4 out of 5. And conflict and villain. The zombies in this are extremely well done. They don't ever explain what starts it. I think the zombies make sense. The way that they portray them, they move slow. They're not fast zombies, but they hoard. And the way they talk about how one zombie can bring about other zombies, or the zombies that are on the ground kind of really tripping you up. It's really intriguing, and again, because each story is different, you get to see a lot of the different ways that the zombies can attack, and not just the ones you would normally think of. There is some parts with the zombies being in the water that I wanted more detail on, and I wish I had got maybe a little bit more of the origin to it, so again, for that, I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5. A very high rating for plot because I think this is definitely the highlight, so we give it an 18 out of 20. Our last category is world. Because this is set at our world, some of these are a little bit different than you would see for a book set in a different world. So you have backstory, detail and settings when describing things, the society, and the government. So backstory, this whole book is them kind of looking back through the last decades. The whole book basically is backstory on World War Z. I think, again, everything is pretty well described. You get a good sense of how World War Z progressed, how things fell apart in each different section of the world, how different parts of the world came together. And so I think the backstory is really well developed. I don't think there was anything that was missing aside from maybe the backstories as to exactly how zombies came to be in the first place. So for that, I would give it 4 out of 5. Details and setting. Some books have too little details when describing places, some have too much, and I think this one did just enough. It described the gore, it described the fear, the backdrop of each different place that you were in, even the person. For each interview, you get a little paragraph descriptor from the person doing the interview. And so overall, you just get just enough to really feel like you understand what's going on. There's one story in Paris where they're in the tunnels and the catacombs that just, whew, the details there, intense. So yeah. Alright, society. With society, you again get a good overall world view of how things are breaking down and exactly what is going on. It did lack a little bit in the civilian side of how things broke down. And it makes sense that more of the interviews were people in either a military or government or high power position because they're the ones making the influential decisions. Don't get me wrong, there were regular civilian stories and how they moved and survived. They didn't seem to have quite the same feel and intensity to them. I would say as far as society, it was missing just a little bit for me as far as regular civilian life. I also want a little bit of just like, what is it going to look like moving forward? I would give it a 3 out of 5. Government was a really interesting piece of this, and I think it kind of mirrors almost a little bit of what's happening now with everything that's going on in the world, because you do see a lot of hidden agendas, you see a lot of missed opportunities and decisions that just didn't go the way they were supposed to go because whoever was making that decision was out of touch. And you saw a lot of people covering themselves and not worrying about other people, and especially in those higher up positions. And it was a really interesting aspect of this. I'm not usually one who likes too much politics and government in my fantasy, and so I was a little bit worried with this, but I think because of the style, it isn't overwhelming. It's just enough to really get you intrigued with what's going on while still giving you a picture of how shady some of these people are. So, government was really well done. 5 out of 5 for that. So this for world ends up being a 17 out of 20. Bonus points. I can give it 2 bonus points. I am definitely giving it 1 bonus point because this book has a movie that goes along with it, World War Z. It has Brad Pitt in the movie. However, the movie is nothing like the book. They share a title and a concept of zombies, but they're not the same story. It's not even, there are no aspects in this book that happen in the movie aside from, hey, we have zombies now. And it's incredibly frustrating because this book is so good. I can understand how it would be hard to shoot a movie in an interview style, but not impossible. And it is so frustrating to me that a book this good is just thrown out the window to make an action-packed zombie movie when we have so many of those. And this would have been something unique. So hopefully, far into the future, we'll get a legitimate World War Z, but I think it should get a bonus point just for the fact that it deserved better. Don't get me wrong, World War Z is a good movie. It's just not this book. It is not this book. And it should have been. So, let me find our total. Alright, so after some math, we end up with 47 out of 57. So I feel like a 4 out of 5 is a pretty accurate Goodreads rating. I wanted to give it a 5. There were a few things, like I said, the skipping around at the ending, the fact that we don't really get to see how society is going to move forward, and the fact that we don't get to see as much of an origin story for the zombies as I would have wanted is what kept me back from giving it that 5, but I think it could easily be argued that it deserves it. So if you are considering reading this book, or if you never read the book because you watched the movie, especially if you've never read the book because you watched the movie, please read the book because it is totally different and such a good book. Thank you for watching my review. Let me know if you've read this book before and how you felt about it, and if you felt betrayed by the movie like I did. And have a good day. Bye, guys.